All right, what's going on, everyone? A couple quick items here. First off, just wanted to say thank you to my buddy Marcus. You might know him here on YouTube as T-Sply. I have been struggling with the audio and video pieces of YouTube, and he's been just a huge resource. He's just up the road in Tennessee, but always able and willing to jump on a call or text, emails, whatever, to help me get all of this sorted out. So that's been awesome. And thank you to everybody who reached out, email after a video a couple weeks ago. So all of that input was really appreciated. But if everything looks better from here forward, that's on Marcus. If it looks worse, that's on me. But second thing is I'm still in the Army Reserve. So every so often I got to go off and do some training and courses, things like that. I'm taking off for 2 weeks this coming weekend. So I'm trying to get ahead of the content, get some things lined up for posts to come out while I'm gone. But most of the content will probably be in the form of shorts and community posts, and they probably won't be all that timely as it relates to the war in Ukraine. I'm just going to be busy doing Army stuff. Let's go ahead and dive into what happened the last couple days here in Ukraine. We're going to talk about the ceasefire that was or wasn't, or maybe never was. I'm still not exactly sure. There was a Russian strike carried out that a group of pro-Russian military bloggers are calling a fraud. And of course, we're going to talk about the Russian advances in and around Soledar and what that means going forward. So talking ceasefire, before we get into that, I just want to say that the Russian hybrid war doctrine is kind of this mix of employing the information war more directly to what's actually happening on the battlefield. And a part of that is sowing confusion and doubt as to what's actually happening. So in that sense, the ceasefire nailed it. It was spot on, nice and confusing. But at a high level, Putin directed a ceasefire on January 5th, saying, quote, "I instruct the defense minister of the Russian Federation to introduce a ceasefire along the entire line of contact in Ukraine from noon on January 6th to midnight on January 7th. As a large number of Orthodox Christians reside in the area of hostilities, we call on the Ukrainian side to declare a ceasefire to allow them to attend church services on Christmas Eve as well as on Christmas Day." Okay, so my reading of that statement put out by Putin is that Russia will have a ceasefire, and they're asking Ukraine to consider doing the same, not that a mutual ceasefire is dependent upon Ukraine accepting these terms that have been laid out. Ukraine's response was along the lines of, "We can talk about a truce once you've left our country." They really left no doubt that while Russia was going to do what Russia does, Ukraine was going to continue the war as they had been. So Russia says, we're doing a ceasefire. Ukraine says, good for you. Still with me? Then comes January 6th, and reports start coming in that Russian forces have made progress in and around the town of Soledar, north of Bakhmut. I'm going to talk about all of that movement here in a minute, but first, we got to solve this ceasefire mystery. Now, however those lines shifted around Soledar, one thing is certain based off the photos and videos coming out from both sides, and that's that the fighting picked up quite a bit. So as I'm looking through all these reports of what is actually happening in Soledar, I see that the Russian Ministry of Defense puts out that they are continuing to observe a ceasefire. In fact, the only really official messaging coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense during this 36-hour period was talking about how they were repelling Ukrainian attacks. Moving into January 7th, there's a lot of bickering online about who's in Soledar, how far they've advanced, have the Ukrainian lines been overrun, did they move back to a secondary line, and so on. Amidst all this, the Russian Ministry of Defense has no mention of Soledar, but instead continue to say that they are in day 2 of this 36-hour ceasefire. So now it's January 9th, the ceasefire has ended a couple days ago. I'm not really sure anything changed. And look, I have no idea why Putin asked for this ceasefire in the first place, but I have to think based off of how it played out, it was purely political. I say political as opposed to the idea that's often thrown out there with ceasefires, the idea that a force might use it to regenerate, recover, rearm, reequip, whatever, in preparation for future military operations. That could be the case for a longer ceasefire, but in 36 hours, it's not realistic that Russia was going to make any major changes in or around the battlefield, especially given that Ukraine let them know right out the gate that they would not be adhering to any sort of ceasefire. So sticking with it, even knowing that Ukraine would continue to fight, makes it come across as more messaging than anything. And by messaging, I mean that Putin and Russia are able to say, look, we wanted to stop hostilities on Christmas, give everybody a nice little break. It's not our fault. Ukraine is the one that keeps fighting. I'm not really sure that had much of an impact at all, though. Most people didn't seem to think that an actual ceasefire was going to take place. and it looks like it didn't. So I'm not really sure that's going to end up being some major political messaging win for Putin and for Russia. On the topic of ceasefires, though, I'm not sure it's understood just how complicated and risky pulling off one of those actually is. I mean, you've got two forces that have been trying to kill each other day and night for months on end, and then you go out to these battle-hardened warriors and ask them to just, take it easy for a day or two, but not too easy, because at some point in the very near future, we're going to ask you to turn it back on. In a perfect world, sure, but if you were there, would you let your guard down even a little? I mean, nobody's abandoning guard posts or not watching the line in case of some sort of pending attack. And all it takes is one young soldier making a mistake. That leads to retaliation and escalation, and then the whole thing is back on. Realistically, for a ceasefire to have any chance of success, it takes a lot of deliberate effort from both sides, and even then, it's pretty tenuous. Up next, there was a strike carried out in Kramatorsk by Russia. In this strike, the Russian Ministry of Defense said that they killed 600 Ukrainian soldiers in retaliation for the Ukrainian strike on Makivka on New Year's Day. That's something I talked about a couple videos back. Now, pretty quickly after this report came out, some discrepancies started to arise. So a Finnish reporter went to the blast site the morning after this attack, and there was an attack. There were blast craters. Nobody's doubting that. He showed the craters outside of these buildings. The buildings that Russia said they killed 600 soldiers in appeared to still be standing with not an awful lot of damage. He said there weren't any ambulances really moving around the area, no noticeable major cleanup taking place. And look, I'm not there. Anytime something goes boom, there's a chance that people die, but it's hard to overstate the carnage and the chaos of 600 people dying in one location. I mean, the amount of cleanup for that to get all the bodies out of there is probably going to take a couple days. It's definitely not going to be done in the few hours before the sun comes up. Some pro-Russian military bloggers jumped on this announcement from the Russian Ministry of Defense, calling it a fraud and saying that this sort of problem has been going on since the start of the war. They said, quote, "This phenomenon, which has deeply affected our armed forces in recent months, has become an active reason for discussion and condemnation both on our channel and among our colleagues. False reports drawn at every level, meaningless reports, and impunity for those carrying out the activity have long been a constant companion of current events. For example, we are already used to the fact that Mr. Konashikov, in his briefings, destroyed HIMARS installations almost more than Ukraine was supplied. However, sometimes the desire to cover his seat from the investigation reaches incredible heights. And now, in an attempt to play out the situation with the Ukrainian strike on the location of our soldiers in Makivka, the Ministry of Defense issued Operation Retaliation, striking at the location of Ukrainian soldiers in Kramatorsk. Rocket attacks on the night of January 8th fell on the 28th and 47th schools in Kramatorsk, where enemy soldiers were stationed. As you can see from the results from the spot, it was not possible to achieve direct hits on buildings. The missiles hit either the ground nearby or into neighboring garages, knocking out windows and damaging the cladding of schools. It is not clear to us who and for what reason decided that 600 Ukrainian soldiers died inside at once, if the building was not actually hit. Instead of the real destruction of enemy personnel, which would be a worthy response, an exclusively media retaliation operation was invented. Worth noting, there are a handful of pro-Russian military bloggers that have been pretty openly critical of how the Kremlin has carried out this war since the beginning, not really criticizing why the war is being fought, more from a military perspective, that they're not doing things correctly. So this frustration shown by this pro-Russian Telegram channel, it's not new. I bring it up because that 600 number has been thrown around in the press a couple times. I see it in a lot of comment sections and other videos. So it's interesting that a pro-Russian source is coming out and saying that is probably not true at all. Let's move on to the battlefield. In and around Soledar is an area that's getting a lot of attention right now, and rightfully so. This is an area just north of Bakhmut where the fighting's been pretty fierce for a few months now. There has been fighting around Soledar for a while, so it's not like this was necessarily a quiet area at the front. And I would say, big picture, if you zoom back, Soledar is probably going to be tied into the overall Battle of Bakhmut. As of January 9th, it looks like Russian forces have made advances to the north and south of Soledar, as well as having pushed into the eastern outskirts of the town, and there are reports of fighting going on closer to the city center. But take all of that with a grain of salt. It's a very fluid situation. So before we get into the impact of that fight, Yevgeny Prigozhin said something interesting that I want to bring up here. Prigozhin's the leader of the Wagner Group, and I've noticed he's been getting a lot more attention recently, not just from pro-Russian channels, but from like Western media as well, than actual generals in the Russian military. Like, he's getting way more attention than Surovikin, which is crazy when you think about it, right? The leader of a private military group, a fraction the size of the Russian army, is getting more media attention and more press than the commanding general. Anyways, he commented something that I thought was interesting. He said, quote, "Bakhmut is the central point of the Eastern Front and a serious logistics center. And our task there is to die as little as possible and to destroy the enemy as much as possible." So a little bit there, going back to some of Putin's early goals in the war, talking about demilitarization. If you remember, there's been a lot of arguments recently, people saying, why is Russia not moving at all? That signals failure. And others have said, no, the point is not movement, not taking of terrain, but the degradation of the Ukrainian military over time. It seems like Prigozhin is kind of tying into that here. He's, saying our task there is to die as little as possible and to destroy the enemy as much as possible. That's a fancy way of saying a war of attrition. But he continues saying the icing on the cake is the system of Soledar and Bakhmut mines, actually a network of underground cities, in which there is not only a cluster of people at a depth of 80 to 100 meters, but also tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and stockpiles of weapons that have been stored since the First World War. I have no idea if that's true, but if there really are Ukrainian soldiers operating 100 meters below the surface in tunnels, that's going to make for some pretty nasty fighting for whoever tries to clear those out. Now, if you haven't already, you're probably going to start seeing commentary on all ends of the spectrum. Some will say that Soledar falling or losing ground in Soledar doesn't matter at all. Others will say that it is the start of the end of the Ukrainian military and everything is going to collapse from here. I mean, Soledar does matter. If nothing else, those were well-defended positions that Ukraine is no longer occupying. Usually the lines of a secondary position are not quite as developed. There might not be perfect fields of fire, or the pre-planned targets might not be as dialed in as, say, the forwardmost lines. Now, should all of Soledar fall, that gives Russia the possibility of shutting off the northern approaches to Bakhmut, where there are quite a few Ukrainian soldiers. I've heard estimates everywhere from 20,000 to 60,000. Either way, it's a pretty sizable chunk. And if that happens, Ukraine, again, might have to move their lines a little ways back to not leave a flank exposed. And again, moving lines back anywhere potentially decreases their effectiveness and could weaken the overall Ukrainian position in the area. That, of course, is dependent upon Russia fully capturing Soledar, which as of today, January 9th, has not yet happened. So in short, it's something that could lead to more Russian gains, but that's dependent on how the next few phases play out in the area. Kind of a boring assessment. I got it, but that's generally how we've seen this war play out so far. A town falls, the lines shift, they reestablish, and the grind continues. So it's hard to imagine that something drastically different plays out around Soledar. But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.